This is another podcast from Alpha Business Media. You know, the world right now, it feels pretty unstable, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot going on.
We've got all this global uncertainty, regional pressures, and then for countries like Nepal, being landlocked adds another whole layer.
It really does. That geographical reality shapes so much.
Creates this really complex, sometimes, well, difficult picture for businesses, for supply chains there.
Absolutely. Being landlocked inherently means you're navigating dependencies primarily on transit through neighbors like India and China for, well, most trade.
Right.
Any disruption there, policy changes, border issues that can ripple through Nepal's economy almost instantly.
Yeah, and then you pile on the global shocks, inflation driving up import costs, conflicts far away, messing with shipping or energy prices. And you see how vulnerable the whole system can become. I mean, past events like the 2015 blockade showed that vulnerability in a really, really stark way.
Exactly. So just aiming for, smooth day-to-day operations isn't really enough anymore. The focus has to shift, really, to building fundamental economic security, genuine resilience in the face of all this constant flux.
Which is exactly what this deep dive is all about today. We're looking at how Nepal can build that resilience, that flexibility in its supply chains.
Yeah.
And the sources you've brought together introduce this fantastic concept. It's a metaphor, really, called the bamboo grove strategy.
It's a really beautiful and, I think, insightful way to frame it. A bamboo grove isn't just like one strong plant standing alone.
Right, it's a system.
It's an interconnected system, yeah. And that system thrives because of some really key characteristics.
Okay, let's dig into that metaphor a bit. First, those deep roots you mentioned.
That's all about building local strength, having a solid base domestically, particularly in really essential areas like food and agriculture.
So reducing that reliance on imports by boosting your own production, supporting local businesses.
Exactly. Strengthening from within. Then there's the incredible flexibility of bamboo. You know how it bends in the wind?
Yeah, bends but doesn't break, usually.
Right. It rarely breaks. And this translates to adaptability in supply chains, things like diversifying trade routes, having alternative suppliers lined up, being able to pivot quickly when shocks inevitably hit.
Okay, so roots for stability, flexibility for adapting. What else?
Interconnectedness. Think about how bamboo shoots grow so closely together, sharing nutrients underground through their root systems, the rhizomes.
Ah, okay.
This represents the ecosystem, strong collaboration between government, businesses, cooperatives, communities, creating an environment where resilience is sort of a shared goal and a shared effort.
Makes sense. And the last part?
Sustainable growth. A thriving grove isn't built by just, sucking everything out of the soil immediately.
Right, has to last.
It's about vitality that's economically sound, socially inclusive, and environmentally conscious for the long haul, not just short-term gains.
Got it. So our mission then in this deep dive is to use your sources to really unpack this bamboo grove strategy. Pull out the specific insights, maybe some surprising details about how it applies to Nepal's situation right now.
Definitely. And honestly, while our focus is Nepal here, the underlying lessons about strengthening local foundations, building flexibility, fostering that supportive environment in a volatile world.
They're relevant everywhere.
They're incredibly relevant today, yeah. No matter where you are or what industry you're in.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's start with those deep roots then. Where do we begin?
Well, the agricultural sector is undeniably the deepest root of Nepal's economy. It just is.
Still employs a huge chunk of the population, right?
Massive. Estimates vary, but some sources put it as high as 65% of the workforce. And it contributes around a quarter of the GDP.
Wow. And we're talking staple crops like rice, corn, wheat, but also cash crops like ginger, cardamom, tea.
That's right, all those key products. But the sources, they paint a picture of a sector that's vital, yes, but also, well, quite fragile in many ways.
How so?
Productivity is low. Lower than its potential anyway. A big factor is just the prevalence of traditional farming methods and these tiny fragmented land holdings.
I saw the average was only 0.55 hectares. That's really small.
It is. Makes introducing modern farming techniques, mechanization, quite difficult.
And then there's limited access to the basics, I imagine, like technology, good seeds, fertilizers, finance.
All of the above. Plus, the impact of climate change is a growing threat, especially unstable rainfall patterns. Irrigation coverage is still low for arable land, just under 29%.
Although I did see a note that farm-based irrigation systems cover about 70% of the existing irrigated areas.
That's true. FMIS helps where irrigation exists, but expanding that reach is still a big challenge.
Okay, but the most striking vulnerability you mentioned,
Yeah.
it's this paradox, right? Huge agricultural potential, but massive import dependence.
It really is striking. Look at these numbers from the sources. Nepal imported NPR 34 billion worth of paddy and rice from India in just one recent fiscal year, FY 22-23.
34 billion rupees.
And cereal imports hit NPR 36.35 billion in just the first 7 months of the current fiscal year, FY 24-25.
That's a huge amount of money flowing out just for basic food staples.
It is a huge drain on resources.
So how do you strengthen these roots? The sources must suggest some ways forward. Modernization and tech seem like obvious starting points.
Yes, exactly. Promoting scale-appropriate mechanization, things like mini tractors that actually work on Nepal's terrain. Precision farming tools are also mentioned.
Like GPS for mapping fields, GIS for data analysis, even drones for monitoring crops.
And digital advisor platforms are popping up too.
I saw names like Geopolitical, Teleplant Doctor, Kisan app. Sound promising. But is the tech actually being adopted widely? Is it getting out there?
Well, that's the crux of it. Adoption is currently low, but the sources really highlight the potential gain. One study found that each additional technology a farmer adopts could boost their income by over 20%.
20% per tech. That's significant.
It is. And Geokrishi, for instance, has reportedly reached over 237,000 people, supporting something like 51,500 farmers directly.
Okay, that's a decent reach.
Yeah.
But what are the barriers holding back wider adoption? The sources must touch on that.
Oh, yeah. Cost is a big one, obviously. But also farmers' digital literacy levels, just basic access in remote areas, and the practical challenge of maintenance and repairs.
Right, it's not just about having the app.
No. The Geokrishi case study itself pointed out the need for offline support systems like these e-Shatarius's community tech centers, because relying purely on digital access leaves a lot of people behind.
Especially older farmers, maybe, or those with less education.
Exactly. For the roots to be truly strong, the tech needs to be accessible and genuinely usable by everyone. It has to be inclusive.
Makes sense. Okay, beyond tech, improving irrigation seems crucial too. Expanding it, making it more efficient.
Definitely. The sources note that improving something called canal conveyance efficiency, CCE, can significantly boost yields. And using methods like drip irrigation can save a massive amount of water, up to 73% in one study cited.
Wow. And what about the actual inputs? Seeds, fertilizer?
Also, vital pathways. Good seeds are foundational. The sources mention varieties like Manikamana 3 maize or Janak dev potato as examples of what's needed.
But getting them out there widely, and farmers knowing how to use them best, that's the challenge.
That's often the gap. And fertilizers. Well, subsidies have increased usage, that's true, but there are persistent problems. Getting them to farmers on time, ensuring the quality is good, preventing misuse.
Is the idea of a domestic fertilizer plant still alive? I feel like that's been discussed forever.
It has. The sources mention it, but they also note it's kind of hampered by significant cost and technical hurdles. It's not straightforward.
So promoting organic fertilizers is also part of the mix.
It is, yes. Though adoption of that is also reportedly quite slow. It's another area needing support.
What about structures like cooperatives? Do they play a role?
A huge role, according to the sources. They're vital for credit, apparently providing around 30% of total agricultural credit.
30%. That's substantial.
Yeah, and they also provide training, input, support for post-harvest handling, marketing. They're essential, especially for smaller farmers.
But they have their own issues too, I suppose.
They do. Operational challenges, governance issues. They're not perfect, but they are a key part of the ecosystem.
And the government. There are specific programs, right? Like the Prime Minister's Agriculture Modernization Project, PMMP.
Yes. PMMP exists, aiming to transform the sector through designated zones, blocks, grants, that sort of thing.
But how's it doing? Are the results there?
Well, the sources are pretty direct, actually. They describe PMP implementation as far from satisfactory and state that real results remain to be seen. So the intent is there, but the execution seems to be lagging.
Okay, now, here's something that really jumped out at me from the sources and, frankly, sounds a bit concerning for those deep roots. Agricultural subsidies.
Ah, yes, the subsidy.
It's a huge budget item. NPR 107.66 billion allocated over just 5 years. It's a lot of money. But the sources seem to strongly question if they're actually effective.
This is a really critical insight, I think, because it suggests that these vast resources intended to strengthen the base might actually be achieving the opposite in some ways.
How so? What are they saying?
The sources describe systemic corruption and mismanagement that seem to prevent subsidies from reaching the intended small and marginal farmers.
Really? Like what?
Well, one source even reported that as much as 35% of subsidies were allegedly used as commissions.
35%.
Yeah. And reports of subsidized equipment being sold off for cash or politically connected individuals benefiting disproportionately.
Wow. So the money isn't getting where it's supposed to go.
That's what the sources suggest. It points to subsidies acting less like fertilizer for the roots and more. Well, one source actually uses the phrase like a disease.
A disease. That's strong.
It is. Weakening the sector by distorting incentives, diverting resources. It suggests it's not just about the amount of money, but how it's delivered. The sources imply a radical shift is needed, more targeted, transparent, maybe technologically trackable support.
So ineffective tech adoption, mismanaged subsidies.
Mm.
They both seem to point to deeper systemic issues undermining that crucial agricultural base.
Absolutely. And the reasons for low-tech adoption aren't just cost, are they? The sources link it to age, education, access to credit, even how far farmers are from support services. It's all intertwined.
Okay, let's shift slightly. Beyond agriculture, the deep roots also include Nepal's local industry, right? SMEs, small and medium enterprises.
Yes, definitely. They're really the engine of the non-agricultural economy, making up over 90% of firms.
Though a lot are informal. Over half, I think.
That's right, over 50% informal. And they face the classic challenges you see in many developing economies: accessing finance, adopting technology, navigating regulations.
And industry's overall contribution to GDP is still quite low, around 13%.
Relatively low, yes. But there's immense potential there, really rooted in Nepal's unique identity and resources.
You mean high-value products like pashmina, carpets, handicrafts?
Exactly. Organic tea, niche things like mad honey, and increasingly, services like IT are showing promise too.
Are there examples of companies doing this well?
Yeah, the sources mention companies like Formation Carpets and Danfei, who seem to be succeeding by focusing on high quality, authenticity, ethical production, really embodying that made in Nepal value proposition.
And the government strategy, the NTIS, highlights exports like cardamom, ginger, tea.
It does. But these SMEs face challenges that kind of mirror agriculture in some way.
Like needing better access to finance, tech, export markets.
Precisely. And crucially, they also need stronger backward linkages connecting to domestic raw materials to reduce their own reliance on imports.
And quality control seems like a big hurdle too, certification.
A significant one. It's quite telling, isn't it, that Nepal exports most of its cardamom raw to India, where the value add then happens.
Yeah, that speaks volumes.
It highlights the lack of domestic capacity. Nepal needs its own testing labs to certify products properly. Currently, relying on Indian institutions just adds cost and delays.
And even for the Indian market, getting BIS certification helps, but there's still other issues. SPS standards.
Right, sanitary and phytosanitary standards, basically health and safety rules, these remain a major barrier, especially for getting agricultural exports into India smoothly.
Okay, if we connect this back to the bigger picture, this whole effort to strengthen domestic roots in farming and industry, it seems to be facing a significant counterforce, something called the Dutch disease effect, linked to remittances.
Ah, yes. This is a subtle but really powerful dynamic working against strengthening domestic production.
How does that work? Remittances are huge for Nepal.
Massive. NPR, 191 billion in just the first 9 months of the current fiscal year alone. They're vital for household incomes.
Cool.
But they're mostly used for consumption, and that consumption often means buying imported goods, not locally produced ones.
Okay.
And secondly, when so much foreign currency flows into the country, it can push up the real value of the Nepali rupee, the real exchange rate.
Making Nepali goods seem more expensive compared to imports.
Exactly. It reduces the competitiveness of Nepali agriculture and manufacturing, makes it harder for them to compete against cheaper imports, even in the domestic market.
So it directly undermines the goal of strengthening those domestic roots.
It can, yes. The big challenge is finding ways to channel those significant remittance savings into productive investments within Nepal investments that build, rather than erode, the domestic economic base.
Right. So strengthening the roots is foundational, clearly, but it's battling internal issues like policy implementation and these external economic forces like remittances.
Okay, let's move to the second part of the metaphor, flexibility in the wind, adaptability.
Yeah, and flexibility is essential because, let's face it, building those deep roots takes time. The immediate vulnerability really comes from Nepal's overconcentration of trade.
With just a couple of partners, mainly India.
Primarily India, yes. Sources say roughly two-thirds of Nepal's trade is with India. China is the second largest source of imports, but Nepali exports to China are negligible, very small. And this over-reliance, as we mentioned, was really exposed back in 2015 with the border blockade.
Starkly exposed. It paralyzed the country by cutting off essentials, fuel, medicine.
So a key strategic goal has to be exploring alternative trade and transit routes, right? Diversification.
Absolutely. One avenue mentioned is access through Bangladesh, using the port of Mongla. There's a transit agreement in place.
But there's a catch.
There is. The sources note that to really make that work efficiently, Nepal needs a road use agreement with India to transit goods across Indian territory.
Ah, okay. Still involves India.
And a preferential trade agreement, a PTA, with Bangladesh is needed to cut tariffs on Nepali exports, especially agricultural products like lentils, ginger, tea, to make that route economically attractive. Potential exists, but hurdles remain.
What about routes through China? Leveraging those historical links.
Also discussed. But developing significant trade volume that way requires massive infrastructure investment. The proposed Karen-Kathmandu Railway, for example, faces huge technical and financial challenges.
And the infrastructure on Nepal's side of the border needs major upgrades too, presumably.
Definitely. So what's fascinating here is diversifying these major strategic trade routes is crucial for long-term flexibility, yes, but it's a very slow process. Geopolitics, geography, infrastructure costs, they all play a big role.
So flexibility can't just be about these big long-term projects. It also needs to be tactical, operational, things businesses can do now.
Exactly right. This involves adopting more agile supply chain management practices day to day.
Like what?
Things like building really robust supplier relationship management, SRM, deep trust, open communication, collaboration with your partners, both domestic and international.
And not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Multi-sourcing.
Yes, multi-sourcing, not relying on a single supplier for critical inputs.
Yeah.
Maybe looking at nearshoring or even onshoring some production where it makes sense to bring it closer.
Okay. What about inventory?
Flexible inventory management is also key. For critical goods, maybe moving away from a strict just-in-time model, which minimizes stock, towards more of a just-in-case approach, holding some safety stock.
Precisely. Holding strategic safety stocks can buffer against sudden disruptions. Better forecasting helps. Smartly segmenting your inventory based on risk, maybe using decentralized warehouses closer to customers. These things improve responsiveness.
And digital technologies must play a role here too.
Hugely powerful enablers. Real-time tracking of goods using IoT sensors, supply chain software that increases transparency, lets you see problems coming sooner.
And connecting businesses. I saw mentions of online B2B platforms like B2B MAP or Swadeshi.
Yeah, those can help connect Nepali businesses with a wider range of partners, both at home and abroad. Logistics tech is emerging too, startups like Tamak working to digitize transport management.
And we talked about Geopolitical and agriculture, that access to timely information helps farmers adapt too, right? Weather, pests, market prices.
Absolutely. That's flexibility at a very fundamental level, having the information to make better decisions quickly.
Okay, but this raises that important question again. We see the potential of digital tech for both routes and flexibility, but we also talked about the digital divide. Access issues, literacy, costs, especially outside the main cities.
Yeah, and for the bamboo grove's flexibility to really reach everyone, these digital tools have to be inclusive. If large segments of the population or small businesses can't access or use them effectively, the benefits are limited.
So maybe hybrid models. Online platforms combined with offline support.
Exactly. Things like those ishataris we mentioned. You need ways to bridge that gap and ensure everyone can contribute to and benefit from this digital agility.
And one last piece of flexibility seems to be learning from past crises, like the 2015 earthquake and blockade. Devastating, yes, but also lessons learned.
There were definitely harsh lessons in vulnerability. And those events did spark some initial efforts towards diversifying fuel sources, for example. Increased interest in electric vehicles to cut dependence on imported petrol.
Wasn't there a fuel supply deal discussed with China around that time?
There was, yeah. Though the sources suggest its implementation has been quite slow, not really materialized significantly yet.
So what's the key takeaway on learning from crises?
It seems to be that while crises can catalyze adaptation, the urgency often fades once the immediate pressure is off.
Complacency creeps back in.
Perhaps. For true resilience, these adaptations need to be institutionalized, baked into ongoing risk assessment, proactive planning, continuous investment in alternatives, not just reacting after the next shock hits.
Okay, so strengthening roots, building flexibility, vital pieces. But they don't happen in a vacuum, right? They need the right environment, the soil and water for the grove to flourish. Let's talk about that third aspect, creating an enabling ecosystem.
Right, and government policy and infrastructure are absolutely fundamental to this ecosystem. Well-designed, effectively implemented policies provide the direction.
A robust infrastructure provides the connections, the resources.
Exactly. And Nepal has policies on paper aimed at supporting this vision. We've mentioned the Agricultural Development Strategy, ADS, PMP, the National Trade Integration Strategy, NTIS, the recent Trade Policy 2025.
Yeah, there seems to be no shortage of strategies.
And the recent budget for FY25-26 includes support for sectors like IT, hospitality, startups. It even allows Nepali companies to invest overseas now. The central bank, the NRB, is also trying to help manufacturing by easing some lending rules, like for letters of credit.
Okay, sounds positive, but is there a but?
There is. The sources repeatedly, almost unanimously, hit on the same critical point. Implementation is the major bottleneck. Again, policies are described as being far from satisfactory in execution. Persistent bureaucratic barriers, red tape.
So even with good intentions in the budget or policies.
The follow-through is the concern. The Confederation of Nepalese Industries, CNI for instance, welcomed parts of the new budget, but explicitly voiced concerns about whether it would actually be implemented effectively.
And some experts feel it's not bold enough.
Yeah.
Lacks deep reforms.
That's mentioned too, yes. Some feel it lacks the truly bold structural reforms needed. The World Bank also points to policy inconsistency due to frequent bureaucratic shuffles as a risk factor.
So this persisting gap between designing policy and actually making it work on the ground, it weakens the whole ecosystem.
It really does. It means the soil and water aren't reliably delivered, or maybe they're poor quality because of lack of coordination, political instability, or, as we saw with subsidies, misused resources. Strengthening governance, institutional capacity, it's absolutely paramount for any strategy to actually succeed.
Okay, what about the physical infrastructure piece? Roads, energy.
Also critical. Poor road networks, for example, significantly increase logistics costs. That makes local goods less competitive. Simple as that.
Energy. Nepal has huge hydropower potential, right?
Immense potential. And the Nepal Electricity Authority, NEA, is expanding capacity. They're building interconnections for potential electricity export to India, even Bangladesh. Nepal has actually started exporting small amounts.
But even there, challenges exist. Delays, EPA issues.
Yes. Projects face delays, issues with negotiating power purchase agreements, and even climate-related risks affecting water flow for hydro dams. It's complex.
Digital infrastructure is getting budget too. NPR $7.4 billion.
It is, which is good for enabling tech adoption. But again, we run into those digital literacy and access gaps hindering widespread use.
And logistics performance overall. Nepal's ranking isn't great.
Below average, yeah. Around 109th in the Logistics Performance Index mentioned in the GII 2024 report. Issues persist at key border points like Burgan, Fakarbita, things like inefficient monitoring, even lack of basic facilities like clean water and sanitation.
And quality standards. Strengthening Nepal's AP for agriculture, getting BIS certification for India, that's vital.
Absolutely vital for competitiveness. But then we circle back to that recurring problem.
The lack of domestic testing labs.
Exactly. Forcing reliance on external facilities, often in India, adding cost and time. It all reinforces the need for robust domestic institutions and infrastructure to truly nurture the ecosystem.
Okay, so policy and infrastructure are the soil and water. What about the people? The grove keepers. Human capital and cooperation.
This is identified as a major constraint. Nepal faces significant brain drain.
Skilled people leaving the country.
Yes, particularly qualified youth. It creates shortages in crucial sectors. Agriculture needs skilled people, tourism, manufacturing.
And while remittances help family incomes, they kind of contribute to this out-migration, don't they? Creating a vacuum.
That's the difficult trade-off, yeah. It creates a vacuum of the very skills needed for modernization and growth.
So without skilled people, trained farmers, good managers, engineers, the grove can't really be managed effectively.
Pretty much. You can have the best strategies, but you need the people to execute them. Initiatives like the Decade of Jobs idea are mentioned as needed, but they require seriously addressing education quality, relevant job training, and creating attractive opportunities at home to retain talent.
And what about cooperation? Industry associations.
They play a vital role. Groups like FNCCI, Federation of Nepalese Chambers of Commerce and Industry, and CNI, Confederation of Nepalese Industries, act as important collective voices for businesses, engaging with the government on policy, infrastructure needs, and so on.
And innovation within companies. That helps adaptability too.
Definitely. The sources mention practices like open book management, having purpose-driven leadership, allowing job crafting so employees shape their roles, building social capital through mentoring. These things boost employee engagement and a company's own capacity to adapt and change.
Okay, if we try to connect all these ecosystem elements, the sources seem to highlight a lack of coordination, right? Individual policies, monetary, fiscal, trade, agriculture, not always pulling in the same direction.
That's a key point, yes. They can sometimes work against each other. For example, the central bank might ease monetary policy to encourage lending.
But if fiscal policy isn't channeling funds into productive domestic investment,
It might just end up fueling more consumption of imports. Or a trade policy promoting exports is hampered if the agricultural sector can't produce enough quality goods, or if the roads are too bad to get them to market efficiently.
so a truly enabling ecosystem needs a much more holistic, integrated government approach where all the different parts work together.
Exactly. Nurturing that environment means cultivating quality soil and water through effective policy and infrastructure, and empowering skilled keepers through human capital investment and strong collaboration. It all needs to connect.
Right. Okay, so let's try to summarize this deep dive then. We've explored Nepal's challenges and the potential offered by this bamboo grove strategy. It seems to offer a path to resilience built on, first, strengthening those local roots, agriculture, SMEs.
Then cultivating flexibility through diversification, agile management, adopting tech inclusively, learning from crises.
And finally, nurturing a supportive ecosystem coherent policy that's actually implemented. Vital infrastructure, skilled people, and strong collaboration.
It's clearly a dynamic strategy, isn't it? Not a static plan. It requires continuous effort on multiple fronts.
And the sources seem to offer some key recommendations based on this. For businesses, it sounds like, embrace tech, invest in your people, build strong partnerships, diversify your suppliers, work together through associations.
Yeah, that covers the business side. And for policymakers, the message seems to be align your policies, prioritize smart infrastructure, seriously reform subsidies to make them transparent and effective, create a stable investment climate, really support SMEs, invest heavily in human capital to counter brain drain, and significantly improve standards and certification infrastructure.
It sounds like adopting this comprehensive bamboo growth strategy offers Nepal a really powerful way to boost its economic resilience, reduce vulnerability to all these shocks,
Improve food security for its own people.
create sustainable domestic jobs, and move towards more stable long-term development. But really requires everyone, government, businesses, civil society, to be rooted, flexible, and, well, grow together.
Like the bamboo itself, yeah. Combining those deep foundations with adaptable strength and that communal growth, the Nepalese economy can build the robustness it needs to thrive in this complex, constantly changing world.
This whole deep dive into Nepal's situation and the bamboo growth strategy, it really shows how fundamental building resilience is today, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Wherever you are, whatever you do.
It really does. And the sources consistently highlight that the success of any strategy, no matter how well designed it looks on paper, ultimately hinges on effective implementation and coordination on the ground, the doing part.
Right. So here's a final thought, maybe for you, the listener, to consider. How much does the true success of any plan, really anywhere in the world, ultimately come down not just to having the right strategy written down, but to the messy, persistent, coordinated work of actually doing it? Something to think about.